This is going to be a fun video because it's a fun and exciting story I have to tell you. I'm sure you've all heard of these stories of people in America going to an abandoned barn and finding under the hay a 1932 Cadillac or Rolls Royce. I believe they called them barn finds. Well, this story is about a musical barn find, if you will. I'm sure that you all have the same experience as me and my wife. We live here in central Italy, but I'm sure it's the same where you are, that when you go into a junk shop, you always dream of finding that Ming vase, or perhaps a painting that you later take to the Antiques Roadshow and find out that it was a Renoir. We've had this dream, but it has never happened. We find things that are interesting, things that are unusual, things that we like. We find bargains, but we never really have found that significant thing, that dramatic thing, dramatic enough to make a video about. Until this spring, we actually did. It was back in February that my wife and I were going to this local junk shop, and we were looking around, and then it was a kind of junk shop where the man clears out apartments and sells things as fast as he can without too much attention to the individual prices. It's the kind of place we like. And there we finally came across something that was really special. I mean, something that made up for visiting second-hand shops for the last 60 years without finding anything dramatic. It all started with my wife saying, "Hey, did you see the piano?" And I said, "No, what piano? Where?" And she said, "It's over there." She pointed to a sort of storehouse with no door. So I went over to have a look. I mean, I had no real intention of actually buying a piano. I mean, I can't really play the piano. My one real regret in life is that I've never learned to play the piano. And then the Christmas before COVID, my family gloriously presented me with a brand new electronic keyboard. The thought was great, but as I unwrapped it, I have to admit I had mixed feelings. I mean, I was already 73 years old, a bit long in the tooth to start learning the piano, but in these intervening years I couldn't resist trying. I've taught myself a few little pieces of Bach, which amuse me. So I went over to look at this piano, and there it was, under stacks of furniture, a real grand piano. These photos I actually took a little later, after the man had already taken off various bits of furniture that were stacked on top of it, so that I could get a better look at it. I mean, it was a real grand piano. Wow. I went over and opened it up, and my heart stopped for a second. I mean, do you see what it is? It's a bit difficult to make out the maker's name. The only name I could think of was Erard, E-R-A-R-D. But the first letter didn't look like an E. It looked more like an S. This was not a familiar logo. So I got out my phone, and right there in front of the piano, I Googled Erard. And that was the logo. This piano actually was an Erard. My heart was racing. The dealer had never heard of the make, but said the previous owner had assured him that Giuseppe Verdi used to play on a piano of this kind. The name Erard is virtually unknown today, but if you like, it was the Steinway of the 1800s. The fact is, I was probably one of the few people in this whole area who had ever even heard of an Erard. You see, I might not be a pianist, but I recently read a biography of Liszt, and there they talked of Erards all the time. To appreciate this story, allow me to take just a moment to fill you in on the significance of Erard pianos. Sebastien Erard was born into a world where kings wore powdered wigs and silk stockings. It was 1752. Johann Sebastian Bach had just died, and Mozart would soon be born. Sebastien Erard grew up into a world of twanging harpsichords and early plinking pianos with small keyboards. As a young man, he had worked as an apprentice to a manufacturer of harpsichords in Paris, but quickly proved himself to be a prodigy. He was full of new ideas for making pianos, and he was not even 30 years old when he founded his own piano company. He quickly established himself as the piano maker for the aristocracy. His pianos were full of interesting innovations. Even the Queen of France, Marie Antoinette, wanted these latest Erard pianos. At least 2 pianos made by Erard for Marie Antoinette still exist today. But then came the French Revolution, and he had to escape to London. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, of course, famously died under the guillotine. In London, he set up another Erard factory, which went on to have a long and successful business, making pianos and harps. But when he saw the revolution in France was calming down, he returned to Paris and continued his personal revolution in piano making. In 1801, as a marketing ploy, he sent one of his pianos to Vienna for the 70-year-old Joseph Haydn, and in 1803, Beethoven, who was also living in Vienna, ordered one for himself. A visitor to Beethoven at the time reported that Beethoven was so enchanted with his French piano that he regards all the pianos made here in Vienna as rubbish. The Emperor Napoleon even bought his new young wife, Marie-Louise, this Erard piano in 1810, as nothing less than a wedding present. Queen Victoria and her husband, Prince Albert, used to make music together on this specially made 1856 London Erard, which is still in Buckingham Palace today. And look, in this 3-volume, 1,500-page biography of Franz Liszt by Alan Walker, a great read, by the way, it's full of Erards. The Erard Company sponsored Liszt in his early concert days, and everywhere Liszt went, he played on an Erard piano. Let's just read a few short passages to get a feel of how important the Erard piano was in those days. It goes without saying, of course, that Franz Liszt was one of the greatest piano virtuosos of all time, and he was a remarkable composer. Well, let's look at what his father, Adam Liszt, wrote to Carl Czerny, Liszt's celebrated piano teacher when Liszt was still just a young boy. Czerny himself had been one of Beethoven's star pupils. "I believe," Liszt's father wrote, "Sebastien Erard merits an important place in the field of piano manufacturers. The Erard piano reaches such a high level of perfection that it looks forward to the next century. It is impossible to describe it. One must see it, hear it, play it." And during the concert tours that young Liszt undertook around Europe when he was barely a teenager, whenever possible, Liszt played on Erard's new 7-octave piano, whose musical advantages were fast becoming obvious to everyone. This instrument produced a strong full tone, and its double escapement mechanism made the faultless execution of trills and rapidly repeated notes a realistic possibility, perhaps for the first time in the history of the piano, which was a constant source of wonder and amazement. Liszt went on to dedicate musical compositions to Sebastien Erard. Erard died in 1831, and the Erard Company was taken over by his 37-year-old nephew, Pierre Erard, who also inherited Sebastien's rather grand chateau in Paris, Chateau de la Muette, near the Bois de Boulogne. One can see that piano making had been very good to Sebastien. And here we have Liszt, while he was on tour in Italy, writing to Pierre Erard the morning after a concert he'd given in the La Scala Opera House in Milan. Let them not tell me any more that the piano is not a suitable instrument for a big hall, that the sounds are lost in it, that the nuances disappear. I bring as witnesses the 3,000 people who filled the immense Scala Theatre yesterday evening, from the pits to the gods on the 7th balcony, all of whom heard and admired, down to the smallest details, your beautiful instrument. This is not flattery. You have known me too long to think me capable of the least deception. But it is a fact, publicly recognized here, that never before has a piano created such an effect. And so you see, the Erard was a very special piano. I could go on, but I think you get the idea. Well, allow me just one more. Pierre Erard died in 1855, and the company was taken over by his wife, Camille Erard. And so we have Wagner, who was married to Liszt's daughter Cosima, begging Liszt, his father-in-law, to get Madame Erard to send him a grand piano. By 1856, Wagner's pleas had become arrogant imperatives. "Franz, I have an inspired idea. You must get an Erard grand piano for me. Write to the widow. Tell her 100,000 fibs, and make her believe that it is a point of honor for her that an Erard should stand in my house." Today, the piano sits in pride of place in the Wagner Museum in Lucerne in Switzerland. So perhaps now you understand why I couldn't believe that the piano in front of me in this junk shop was one of the famous Erards. A question came to me that if I wanted to buy it, how much would it cost? But there my wife was ahead of me, as she usually is. She told me she had already asked him, and he said he wanted €1,000 for it. €1,000. That didn't sound like a lot for such an historic piano. But get this, as my wife is an old antique market aficionado and knows a thing or two about the art of the deal, she has a stall selling English porcelain in the local market. She had already argued him down several €100. He said he wanted to get rid of it. He said he wouldn't take on another piano again, especially a grand piano. People don't have the room for them anymore. And besides, people don't play the piano as much as they used to. Less than €1,000. To my mind, a ridiculously low price for such a treasure. I mean, even for me, a pensioner with a love for history and music, I could almost consider buying it. I was wondering whether it was in working condition. The dealer told me that he had got it from a clergyman's house in a nearby village. He showed me some photos of when they picked it up. It looked like it had been taken care of. And then he mentioned they even gave him an old letter from when it had changed hands over 100 years ago. This letter, in fact, dates from 1877 and is a sort of an IOU from a Dr. Vulpiani of Rome to a Signora Luigi Hoffman. The price of the piano was 1,700 lira, and the buyer actually finished paying for it 4 years later in 1881. I mean, this was a museum piece. It looked in relatively good condition, in spite of the dust and the pieces of furniture that had been stacked on top of it. And in spite of it being stored in a warehouse without a door, open to the elements. Fortunately, this was Italy and not Scotland. No disrespect meant to Scotland. A couple of notes looked like they needed repairing, and it was, of course, hopelessly out of tune. But generally speaking, the piano looked splendid. The ivory keyboard looked a bit dirty but intact, and there was no noticeable damage to the strings. Hiding my excitement, I told the man that I would think about it. The dealer shared with me some more photos, including one of what looked like a serial number. As soon as I got home, I fired up the computer and did some searching on the internet. And if that was the serial number, it looked like the piano was actually made in 1850, at the zenith of the fame of the Erard. That would make it 175 years old. Pianists fight to play on such a period instrument. The dealer obviously only had a vague idea of the real artistic value of the piano. But these days, grand pianos really don't sell very well outside of specialized piano dealers. And as for the question of having the space to house it, our living room is actually a converted cow stable. So we really did have the space. I went back the next day with a friend who understands the technical aspects of pianos better than I do, and he thought it was in surprisingly good condition. So, brushing hesitation aside, we actually bought it. And then we gulped when we found that a mover wanted 350 euros to bring it to our house. And here there's an interesting thing in a book I'm reading at the moment by the French painter François-Auguste Biard. He did a fun drawing of moving a grand piano in Rio de Janeiro in 1858, but that wasn't an option here in Umbria. And then after a bit of cajoling, the dealer finally agreed to bring it to the house for just 50 euros extra. So now we owned an 1850 Erard grand piano. But now we had to get an expert to take a look at it. And we were wondering how much that would cost.
Wow, wow, wow.